ॐ नमो नारायणाय ॐ नमो नारायणाय
Asmad Gurubhyo Namaha, Asmad Paramagurubhyo Namaha, Asmad Sarvagurubhyo Namaha. We're continuing on with Vedanta Sangraha of Ramanuja. We're still in the introduction of the edition by Rajgopal Iyengar, printed in 1956. So, which we consider to be a good version. Let's have a look at that. So we started talking about the philosophy of Vishishtadvaita, Ramanuja's philosophy, after having a couple of classes in the beginning on discussing Advaita Vedanta. Now we know Shankara's philosophy, and we're understanding a little bit about Ramanuja's philosophy. So the last thing we were talking about is that if you know clay, then you know everything made out of clay, and how that analogy works. So we'll continue on. Towards the end of this same chapter of the Chandogya Upanishad, so we're talking about Upanishadic statements, the well-known sentence, Tat Tvam Asi, that thou art, right, is repeated several times, as it were, to enforce the teaching in Swetaketu's mind. To the Advaitin, this is a Mahavakya. Now, what's a Mahavakya? Okay, a Mahavakya means a great saying. Vakya means saying, and Maha means great. So Mahavakya is one of these sentences in the Upanishads, in the Vedas, that has got a lot of meaning according to different people. So the Advaitins, they have several of these Mahavakyas. Aham Brahmasmi, here we're talking about Tattvamasi, okay? They call them Mahavakyas. So to the Advaitin, this is a Mahavakya teaching the identity of the Jiva with Brahman, with the Supreme Brahman, right? The identity of the Jivatman with Sriman Narayana, with the Supreme Brahman. Tat, meaning that, right, is Brahman, right? The ultimate and only real thing, on which the illusory world appears, right? Remember that the Advaitins say because of adhyasa, because of a superimposition of avidya or ignorance or maya or illusion on the real Brahman, we see the world and we see the souls. But these are only illusions ultimately. So, Tvam, or thou, or you, meaning you, is Swetaketu. So they say Tattvamasi. Asi is just the verb to be. So Tattvamasi means that Brahman, that Supreme Brahman, is you, Swetaketu, is you. That's what Tattvamasi means in Chandogya Upanishad. That's what they say. So Tvam is Swetaketu, who is addressed by his father. So his father says, Tattvamasi, you are that Swetaketu, right? The two are said to be the same. The Jivatman and the Supreme Brahman. The Advaitin asks, can there be a more emphatic declaration of unity or identity of Brahman and the Jiva than these words, which are repeated ever so many times in that context? Okay. So that sounds like a rhetorical question that the Advaitin is just asking. Look at how clear this is. Look at how clear this statement of identity between the Jivatman, the individual soul, and the Supreme Brahman is in this statement. This Mahavakya declares that there is only one real, namely Brahman, which is the cause or substrate, or underlying substance of the origin, maintenance, and dissolution of the world, and it is declared to be the individual self of Swetaketu, in that thou art. But on the face of it, the sentence would appear to convey no coherent meaning. For how can the individual self of Swetaketu, with its limited powers, be the same as the Supreme Brahman, which is infinite? So the direct or primary meaning of the word thou, right, will have to be given up as being incongruous and a secondary or indirect meaning. Lakshana. Lakshana means quality, or lakshana means a definition, right? Will have to be taken. Will have to be taken. Okay, so this is interesting because he's talking about here mukhya vritti and gona vritti. He's talking about the literal meaning of tvam, thou, you, and an indirect meaning or a secondary meaning. So sometimes when we read something, we take the literal meaning, but when the literal meaning doesn't make any sense, so he's saying to take this literally doesn't make any sense, right? Because how can we believe that the supreme Brahman is the same as this finite Svetaketu, Jivatman? So when we have a statement that cannot be understood literally, cannot be accepted literally, or doesn't make sense literally, then we look for another meaning. There might be another secondary meaning that is called the gona vritti, right? So, or the indirect or secondary meaning. The result of this would be that would mean pure Brahman without attributes, activity, change, or relations of any kind, and thou should be taken to mean not the individual self of Svetaketu, which is a direct meaning, but Brahman without the limitations, attributes, and activities, etc., of the individual, a meaning arrived at by taking recourse to the indirect meaning or lakshana. There would then be no equation of two different things, but an identity or unity, namely Brahman. Okay, so what he's saying here is that he proposes a secondary meaning for tvam, you, to mean Brahman without limitations, attributes, or activities of the individual, right? So not perhaps anyway. The Advaitin who gives this explanation of the Mahavakya that thou art illustrates it with an example from ordinary life. Having seen a person called, say, Devadatta in the past in a certain place, we now see him, say, in another place, and say, this is that Devadatta, this is that Devadatta, like that. He could also be saying here that instead of saying you, Svetaketu, it is the Paramatman within Svetaketu. It is the Supreme Lord situated within this body of Svetaketu that is meant. So this is that Devadatta. So if we see Devadatta somewhere, and then later on we see him in a different place, then we say, oh, this is that person Devadatta that we met before. Since the Devadatta seen formerly in one place cannot be the same as the Devadatta seen now in a different place. Okay, that's not making a lot of sense to me. Since the Devadatta seen formerly in one place cannot be the same as the Devadatta seen now in a different place, why not? We have to resort to lakshana and give up the qualifications, relationships such as formerly or in the place or now. Okay, so what he's speaking of very literally, if we say that Devadatta was in one place and he was seen in a particular place, and if that is a qualification of Devadatta, that he has to be seen in that place or he has to be seen at a particular time, and then if we see a similar person at a different place, a different time, but we equate that as Devadatta, therefore we have to give up these lakshanas or these qualifications or qualities of the first Devadatta that we saw as being in a particular place or a particular time, as being essential, as an essential thing that qualifies Devadatta from other persons, right? Because a lakshana means a quality which distinguishes one thing from another thing, right? For example, if we have four-legged animals, we have cows and we have horses, right? Both of them have four legs. So if I say I cannot say that a lakshana of a horse or lakshana of a cow is four legs, because it's not a distinguishing quality, because both cows and horses have four legs. So if I say, look, there's an animal with four legs, it doesn't mean it's a cow or a horse. It could be another animal with four legs. But for example, if I have an animal over there, if I say there's an animal over there with a trunk, there's only one animal that has a trunk, and that's an elephant. So the elephant has this trunk, and the trunk is a lakshana, is a quality, is a qualification or a quality, a distinguishing quality of the elephant. Whereas four legs is not, it doesn't distinguish one animal from another, because there are many animals that have four legs. Okay. Okay. So that's just to understand the word lakshana, exactly what it means in Sanskrit. Okay, so here, what results is thus giving up the direct meanings, which would not convey a coherent meaning, is the bare identity, namely Devadatta, the bare identity without all the other adjectival or qualifying qualities of Devadatta, that we saw him at a particular place at a particular time. So also Brahman, in that thou art. Okay, so that's their idea. In reply to this Advaitic explanation of the identity as contained in that thou art, Ramanuja submits the whole question of appositional or coordinative use of words, right? As in that thou art. Janaka is king, right? This is that Devadatta. Ayodhya was the capital of the Raghus, right? And so on, to careful investigation. So in all of these cases, in all of these sentences, example sentences here, we have two nouns or a phrase and a noun which equal each other, which are exactly the same, but they're, so for instance, Janaka is a king. So the king is Janaka. It's the same person. That thou art, that and thou are the same. That is that, this is that Devadatta. Devadatta and that is the same. Ayodhya and the king, the capital of the Raghus, is the same. So in each of these cases, there are two aspects, right, which equal each other exactly. So Ramanuja wants to talk about that situation, right, and explain that. It is really a question for grammarians to decide. What do we really mean when we say Janaka is a king? It is simply the identity of Janaka or something more. Is it simply the identity of Janaka or something more? Right? So for example, right, so when we say Janaka is king, we're also saying something about Janaka. He's just not an ordinary person. He's a king, which means that he probably has a crown, he has a castle, whatever, he has a palace. Okay, so it's a qualifying adjectival word, right? So also Ayodhya was the capital city of the Raghus. Is the purport merely Ayodhya or something else? This kind of grammatical apposition or coordination of two substantive words means nouns, right? But in one case, the capital of the Raghus is actually a phrase, it's not just nouns, but anyhow, he's saying substantive words, is called samanadikaranya in Sanskrit. And as that thou art, the Advaitins Mahavakya, one of their great sayings, is an instance of samanadikaranya. Ramanuja considers it necessary to determine the meaning and purpose of this appositional use more than once in Vedanta Sangraha. The purpose of samanadikaranya is to show that two or more different attributes, qualities, or relationships refer to a single object. That's what Ramanuja says. That is the meaning for this grammatical situation where you have these two substantives which equal each other. So, for example, Janaka is a king. The word Janaka signifies a person with a specific form and with that name. The word king means something different, namely his being the ruler of the kingdom. The sentence having the coordination or the samana adhikaranya aims at showing that these two sets of different attributes meet in the same person, and it is not a bare identity of Janaka, as the Advaitins say, see? So, in the example cited by the Advaitin, this is that Devadatta, Ramanuja says that there is no incoherence or absurdity in taking the direct meaning of the words just as they are. That is, the Devadatta formerly seen in place A is the same person as the Devadatta now seen in place B. The same person could have been in one place in the past and in a different place in the present. Where is the absurdity in it? So, we may take the direct meanings of the words. The Devadatta seen in the past in the place A is the Devadatta seen in the present in place B. That's the meaning of this is that Devadatta. So, in fact, the aim of Samanadhikaranya is just to show that being present in A at a former time and being present now in B are both in Devadatta. They are both qualities or qualifications or qualities of Devadatta. There is absolutely no reason why we should give up the direct or primary meaning. It may be asked, what is the relevancy of all this discussion of the meaning of Samanadhikaranya to the interpretation of the Mahavakya that thou art? Ramanuja replies as follows. When the direct or primary meanings of that and thou may be taken just as they are, and a sound, coherent, and valid meaning can be had for the sentence, then where is the need for resorting to the secondary meaning or lakshana, the indirect meaning or secondary meaning? He then proceeds to explain what he considers to be the real meaning of Tattvamasi, that thou art. That, of course, signifies the Supreme Brahman, who is the cause of the origin, maintenance, and dissolution of the world. Thou, at first sight, would seem to mean Swetaketu, or Swetaketu's self is Jivatman. But it really means here the soul or the inner self within the soul of Swetaketu. In other words, the Paramatman. When we use the word or name Devadatta, it refers to the bodily configuration of Devadatta. It means his gross and subtle body and including his Jivatman. But along with that Jivatman, there's also the Paramatman. Right. It is not merely his body that is meant by the word Devadatta, but his Atma or soul or self as well. The denotation or meaning of the word does not stop there. It also refers to the soul or the inner self or Antaryami. Antaryami means the super soul, the Paramatman, who has the soul of Devadatta, who is the soul of Devadatta for his body. Who has the soul of Devadatta for his body, right? So the soul of Devadatta is actually the body of God, the body of the Paramatman in this case, as set forth in the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad. Remember that Antaryami Brahmana, it comes from Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad. So that thou art means Brahman, who is the cause, the support, etc. of the world, is also the inner self or the Antaryami, the Paramatman, the super soul, who dwells within the soul of Swetaketu. Here, two different attributes, that of being the cause, etc., maintenance and destruction of the world, and that of being the inner self of Swetaketu, are ascribed to the same object. That is, namely, Brahman, the Supreme Brahman. So the Supreme Brahman is at one at the same kind, is the creator, maintainer, and destroyer of everything, right? At the same time, he is also the inner soul, the Paramatman or the Antaryami of Swetaketu. That makes perfect sense. And this is the real purport or significance of Samanadhikaranya. as understood by grammarians, whose authority in a matter like this should be unquestioned. Okay, so samana adhikaranya, right, is a grammatical term, right? That we have these two substantives or nouns or noun like parts of a sentence which are equated, right? So, so this can be understood by the grammarians very easily, right? So, but it may be asked, is not Ramanuja also giving up the primary and direct meaning of thou, namely Swetaketu's self, and taking up the Lakshana or the indirect meaning or secondary meaning, that is the inner self within the self of Swetaketu, right? So that's a good challenge question to that. Ramanuja's answer is as follows. Take any word. Say the word cow. It has three meanings, all primary and direct, namely the bodily configuration of the cow, the self or the soul of the cow, and likewise the antaryaman, the inner self, the paramatma within the soul of the cow, which is Brahman or God or Ishvara. Laymen who are not acquainted with Vedanta are not aware of the third significance or meaning, which is as direct and primary as the other two. So our interpretation here is sound and in accordance with the Antaryami Brahmanam and the science of grammar. To sum up, in Vishishtadvaita, right, specific monism of Ramanuja, or holistic monism of Ramanuja, as expounded by Ramanuja, the Upanishads impart to us knowledge of only one Brahman, one supreme Brahman, that is Saguna Brahman, or Brahman with infinite auspicious qualities. He has Chit and Achit as his body. The words Nirguna, Niranjana, etc. mean only that Brahman has none of the faults or imperfections found in the Jivatman. Vishishtadvaita agrees with Advaita in holding that the essential nature or swarupa of Brahman is jnana or consciousness, but maintains in addition that Brahman, who is consciousness, has for its attribute jnana. So not only is Brahman essentially consciousness, but also has the attribute of knowledge, the attribute of knowledge or consciousness. Brahman is thus the knower as well as the knowledge of consciousness. Brahman is consciousness, and Brahman has consciousness. Without a knower, there can be no such thing as bare consciousness, right? There can be no such thing as bare consciousness. If the consciousness means that something is a knower, in order for something to be a knower, there has to be something else to be known, right? And also a process of knowing, right? So the knowledge or jnana, which is an attribute of Brahman, is called Dharma Adbhuta Jnana. Dharma Adbhuta Jnana, or attributive knowledge. Attributive knowledge. It is an attribute of Brahman, that knowledge. It is not just that Brahman is knowledge, but Brahman also has knowledge as its attribute. That is called Dharma Adbhuta Jnana. So, to distinguish it from the Swarupa, or the substance of Brahman, which is also called jnana, or consciousness or knowledge, right? As has been pointed out, the Brahman of the Upanishads is also the God of religion who creates, maintains, and sustains the world. It is he who rewards the jiva with mukti, or moksha, or liberation, when he strives for it. The jiva in Vishishtadvaita is as real as Brahman itself. Its essential nature, swarupa, is also jnana, knowledge or consciousness, but it differs from Brahman in being atomic, or anu. It is very small. Whereas Brahman is all-pervasive or omnipresent, vibhu, everywhere. The jivatman has knowledge for one of its attributes, and this knowledge is called Dharma Adbhuta Jnana, attributive knowledge. So not only does the Supreme Brahman the Supreme Brahman, Sriman Narayana, have knowledge, is knowledge, and has knowledge as one of his attributes. But also the Jivatman also has knowledge as one of its attributes. Though the individual self or Jivatman is Anu, its attributive knowledge is capable of infinite reach. I'll say that again, because this is not the same in all forms of Vedanta, right? But according to Ramanuja, even though the Jivatman is Anu, is very small, is infinitesimal, right? Its knowledge is capable of being infinite. So owing, however, to beginningless avidya, avidya means ignorance, or maya, illusion, right? Or karma, karma means those reactions to works, good or bad, done in this body or in previous births. This attributive knowledge has undergone contraction. Okay, so instead of saying contraction, we can just say it's covered, right? It's the knowledge is there, but it's covered. It's covered. So he says here it undergoes contraction. But in the state of moksha or mukti or liberation or release from samsara, this world of birth and death, it will become infinite in its reach and will be capable of understanding all things at the same time. Sri Ramanuja states also that there is another class of individuals called nityas. Nityas, known by some people as nityasuris or nitya siddhas by some people, right? Those souls who were eternally free, who were never bound, who were never samsarans. They were never here in samsara. They were never in this material world, this lila vibhuti, going around in birth, death, disease, and old age cycles. So these are called nityas. In the region of eternal glory, that is Sri Vaikuntham, right? Which he calls nitya vibhuti, right? So Sri Vaikuntham is also known as nitya vibhuti. So we have those two glories of the Lord, the nitya vibhuti, the eternal glory, which is always eternally the same, and the lila vibhuti, which the material world, which undergoes different changes, right, of creation, maintenance, destruction, and recreation again. So their attributive knowledge, remember, Dhammadbhuta Jnana, has always been infinite in its range, and they have never been in the bondage of samsara, those nityasuris or nityas. The arguments by which he establishes this will be seen in chapter 9 of Vedanta Sangraha. So we're in the introduction now. So he's just mentioning that Ramanuja explains all of this later on. So prakriti or matter, right? The thing which one of two things that are here in this material world, one is matter and one is the jivatmans, right, is also real in Ramanuja's system. It undergoes modifications into various tattvas, different principles, numbering 24 in number. The 25th is considered the jivatman, right, which are the same as the 24 realities or tattvas in the Sankhya system of evolution. Right, so if we want to look at the Sankhya system, we can understand the same thing. That's accepted. That form of evolution or creation is accepted in Ramanuja's system. Prakriti or material nature or matter and its evolutes, these 24 reals, right, exist for the enjoyment and experience of the individual souls in accordance with their past karmas, good or bad. Okay, so that is that section. I think this section was about, we had the tattva, right, section, and now we're going to have Purushartha section, and maybe later we're going to have the Hita or the Upaya section about the means. So we're going to talk about the goal in Vishishtadvaita next. All right, so there's a question, and the question is how to understand that in moksha the Jivatma can understand all things at the same time. Can you give an example to illustrate that? How is it that the Jivatma can understand all things at the same time in moksha? Right, so he said this is going to be covered. The arguments are going to be covered in chapter 9 of Vedanta Sangraha. But just to say a little bit here, if we're completely uncovered from illusion, if there is no ignorance, then there is full knowledge, right? And if I say I don't understand something, it's because I'm ignorant of some facts. I'm ignorant of something. if I am completely freed from avidya, ignorance, and illusion, then I see things truly as they are. So if I see things truly as they are, that means I see everything truly as there's nothing that I lack in my knowledge, like that. So logically, if there's no ignorance, if there's no illusion, then there's all knowledge. That's logically, at least one leads from the other, okay? But we'll look at chapter 9 and we'll see what all the different arguments that Ramanuja gives about that. So now let's continue on a little bit about Purushartha. So Purushartha, and this is a very small section that he gives here in the introduction, but it'll be covered also in Vedanta Sangraha in the body of the work. Purushartha is the goal. What is the goal? So now we understood the tattvas. We understood something about tattva, about the principles, right? Now, what is the goal? Purushartha in Vishishtadvaita. The ultimate and supreme goal of life is to attain release from samsara and enjoy the bliss of Brahman, the bliss of being and serving eternally the supreme Brahman in Sri Vaikuntha, the Nitya Vibhuti, right? And not, as in Advaita, to become that Brahman, not to become actually that Brahman, but to have the proper relationship that we have as a servant to that supreme Brahman. The avidya, which is the same as karma, right? So he's equating here avidya or ignorance, right? This in saying that's the same as karma. So when we're covered by these karmas, these avidyas, ignorance, and this maya, illusion, right? The avidya or ignorance, which is the same as karma, belongs to the jiva and not to Brahman, belongs to the Buddha jiva, the bound soul in this material world, Lila Vibhuti, and not to the supreme Brahman. Ramanuja accepts the view that the released soul will enjoy infinite bliss, as well as what we just talked about, infinite knowledge. So the soul, the minute soul, when released from the bondage of samsara into moksha, into liberation, enjoys infinite knowledge and also infinite bliss, infinite happiness, right? In Nitya Vibhuti, or God's region of eternal glory. Now, the actual nature of that state of the soul when it reaches Sri Vaikuntha will be spoken about later on, or in some other literatures and everything like that. But the goal is moksha. What we think of as moksha in Sri Vaishnavism is the performing of eternal service to the Supreme Lord in Sri Vaikuntha. Okay, so now we talk about the means, or the upaya. We now know something about the principles. We know the state of the jivatmans. We know that there is a different type of jivatman that never underwent samsara and is there with Sriman Narayana, serving him eternally. And the goal is to attain that state that those jivatmas, those nityas or nityasuris have. So we want to go from being a nitya buddha to becoming a nitya suri, like that, to become an eternal servant of the Lord in Vaikuntha. That's the goal. Now, what is the means to that? What is the means to getting to that situation? For us to go from here to there, to that situation. The means or upaya of the three yogas taught in the Bhagavad Gita. What are the three yogas taught in Bhagavad Gita? They're Kama Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga. These are three yogas or methods for attaining liberation, right? Bhakti or devotion with its highest development, which Ramanuja calls Parama Bhakti, Parama just means the greatest Bhakti, is the direct and only means of attaining mukti or liberation, right? So karma and jnana are essential, but are only accessories to bhakti, right? So works and knowledge are essential, but they're only accessories to bhakti. Bhakti is the way to bhakti. Parama Bhakti will be explained later on, right? So karma or the rights and duties prescribed for each varna and each ashrama have to be performed as long as life lasts and are on no account to be given up. Okay, this is normally the situation. One of the texts in the Mundaka Upanishad says that Brahman reveals himself only to him with whom he is pleased. the Supreme Brahman would be pleased only with him who has deserved well of him by supreme devotion in accordance with the Shastras. Right. So, okay, so there's a text in Mundaka Upanishad. It says that the Supreme Lord will reveal himself to you, right? If he's pleased with you, and he becomes pleased if you follow his orders that are given in the scriptures, what we call Bhagavad Agyaya, the orders of the Supreme Lord. And the orders of the Supreme Lord involve so many things. They also involve doing these karmas according to Varna and Ashrama, whatever. They may involve all those things. Bhakti is therefore the only means or upaya for attaining the bliss of Brahman. Right? At the same time, Ramanuja states that bhakti and jnana are not essentially different. Bhakti too is a form, is knowledge or jnana. When jnana deepens sufficiently, it attains the form of bhakti. It is this deep jnana or knowledge which has developed into bhakti that is the upaya or the means of mukti, right? So really, it's the ultimately it's the knowledge of our true position that we are eternal servants of the Lord. Once we have that knowledge, that is going to lead to liberation. So in a sense, what Shankaracharya said, jnanat mokshaha, from knowledge comes liberation, is correct in a sense. Okay, so can we equate bhakti with property in this section of upaya? Okay, so property means what? Property means surrendering to the Lord. Surrendering to the Lord. Why do we surrender to the Lord? We surrender to the Lord because why? Because we have jnana, because we have knowledge, right? That we are actually his servants. There is really nothing that we're doing to change that. It's not that we were not his servants and we're becoming his servants. We're always his servants. Now we realize it. That realization is jnana. So property is actually a type of jnana. Bhakti is also a type of jnana. It's a type of jnana. So all of these things come about because of jnana, really, because of knowing our true position. Our true position is that we are slaves or servants of the Supreme Lord eternally. So once you know that, then you have bhakti for the Lord, and then you have and you are surrendered to the Lord. So you have property, right? You do property like that. It's the knowledge of these things which brings about the moksha. I mean, the Lord gives moksha. The Lord gives moksha, but it's the realization which is the important part here, is the upaya. The Lord himself is the upaya, actually, like that. Anyway, so he's not going to directly talk about in terms of property here. He's not going to talk about property. He's going to talk about bhakti, but he's also going to equate bhakti with jnana, like that. So let's go on, because all these terms are very similar, right? So it was said above that the swarupa, or the essential nature of Brahman and of the individual self in its purity, is jnana or knowledge, and that Brahman and the jiva have jnana or knowledge as an attribute, right? Dharma adbhuta jnanam. So it may be asked how jnana or knowledge, which is a substance or a dravya, right? Dravya means substance, right? Could be an attribute of jnana, a swarupa jnana, right? So here we're getting technical. Okay, so we've got substances and attributes, and they're usually two distinct things. But here we have a substance which is also an attribute of the same substance, right? Jnana is not only a substance, but it's also an attribute, right? That attributive jnana is called dharma adbhuta jnana. Attributes are usually of the nature of gunas or qualities, and not substances or dravyas. Ramanuja replies to this objection by stating that there is no such invariable rule that a substance and an attribute have to be separate. Even a substance may be an attribute of another substance, as when we speak of a dandi. A danda means a stick. A dandi is a man with a stick, or a danda. So here, danda is a stick, which is a substance. but it also becomes an attribute because the man has a stick. So when we say, oh, which man? The man with the stick, that's the attribute of that man, is that he has a stick, the other men don't have sticks. So the danda is not only an attribute, it's not only a substance, but it's also an attribute in this case of that man. So the difference is that the stick is not inseparable from the man. The stick is not inseparable from the man because there are other men without sticks, right? Whereas attributive knowledge is inseparable from knowledge, which is the swarupa or substance of the jiva or Brahman, right? So both Brahman and the jiva have this dharma adbhuta jnana. They are essentially knowledge. They are essentially consciousness, right? But they also have consciousness of themselves, both the jiva, the jivatman, and paramatman, the supreme Brahman. So also jiva and prakriti, or matter, those substances, right, dravyas, are inseparable attributes of the supreme Brahman being his body, right? So because we understood before that the jivatman and matter, right, the souls and matter are also considered to be attributes of the Lord's body, so they are also considered attributes, even though they're both substances. Matter is a substance, dravya, and jivatman is also a substance, dravya. But they're also attributes of the Supreme Lord because they're considered to be his body, right? So we have the Upanishadic statement that backs that up. So it was pointed out before that the Advaitin postulates a factor called Maya or avidya. Maya means illusion, avidya, ignorance, which by some kind of shadowing or association with Brahman causes the illusory appearance of the world. This is what the Advaitin says. Ramanuja submits that this theory to elaborate and critical examination and shows that Maya or illusion cannot be defined in any manner to the satisfaction of others, and that it lands Advaita in inconsistencies and contradictions, right? And we know this from before because when we were discussing Shankara's philosophy, right, Advaita, we asked the Advaitin, what is Maya? Is Maya real or is Maya unreal? Because the Advaitin says that only Brahman is real, right? Maya is not real. So if Maya is not real, then how does Maya affect the Jivatman? How does Maya affect Brahman and create the universe and the Jivatman? This doesn't make any sense. So the Advaitin ends up saying anivachaniya. It cannot be described by words, and he says that Maya is neither real nor unreal. It's both real and unreal at the same time. So this is very confusing and complete lands the Advaitin in inconsistencies and in contradictions, right? So these arguments may be studied in the text itself of Vedanta Sangraha. So far as the evidence of the Shrutis or the Upanishads, approaching the question from the point of view of reason, right, of rational reason, logic, Ramanuja does not accept the Advaitin's contention that only what persists forever is real, right? So remember, this was a basic premise or an axiomatic truth to the Advaitin, is that only something that eternally exists in the same way is real. But Ramanuja doesn't agree with that. He doesn't agree with that at all, right? This is not an axiomatic truth for Ramanuja. It may be remembered that in Pratyaksha, according to the Advaitin, there is only one aspect that persists right through, namely the mere existence, or what corresponds to asti, or the verb to be, is, and the being, in other words, pure being, and that this existence of asti alone is real, and that the pot, the cloth, the table, etc., as in the perceptions, this is a pot, this is a cloth, this is a table, and so on, do not persist, as they replace one another and are therefore unreal. Ramanuja states in reply that if an object like a pot is seen to exist in a certain place at a certain time, and another object, say a cloth, is seen there in the next instance or afterwards, it does not follow that the thing which does not persist is unreal, right? Just because we saw something at a certain time and then now it doesn't exist anymore there, doesn't mean that it was unreal. right? To put it in other words, the Advaitin holds that only what exists forever and is not superseded or sublated by anything else is real. Ramanuja, on the other hand, maintains that the reality or unreality of a certain thing has nothing to do with the duration of its existence. A thing may exist only for a short time and yet still be real. The Advaitin might ask thereupon, the objects that we see in dreams are seen only for a very short time during the dream, right? And are replaced or superseded by others. Do you think that these objects or experiences in dreams are real? Is it not agreed on by all, right? By all hands here, he says, by all hands, that dreams are unreal? Ramanuja would reply to this effect. I do not admit for a moment that because a thing exists only for a short time, it is unreal. Dreams, too, are real in our system. They are created by Ishvara, by God, to reward or punish the Jivatman for his karma. The fact of their transience, that they don't exist eternally, right, cannot be considered as a reason to deny their reality, right? Even if we talk about that illusion, the mirage in the desert, the person who's very thirsty in the desert sees a pond and it's not real. It's an illusion like that. But it has a certain type of reality because the person sees it. So just like a dream or even that perception, remember that we were talking about the 3 levels of perception of the Advaitin. He said that there was a paribhasika satta, right, which is that he has mostly he talks about the vyavaharika, which is the vyavaharika, which is normal perception, and then paramartika, which is the ultimate perception that only Brahman is real. But below that, he had a paribhasika satta. For example, the type of illusion that a rope is a snake, right? That we see a rope in a dark room and we think it's a snake. So that as soon as we turn on the light, that doesn't persist anymore. But it's still real when we perceive the snake. When we see in the dark, right? There's a real perception there, right? Otherwise, why would we mistake it for a snake? There's a real perception there. We see something in the dark, and we've seen snakes before. We know what a snake is, and we mistakenly think it's a snake. So there's a real perception that goes on there. The thing which is perceived doesn't persist. It's only there for a second, the perception that it's a snake. But still, that's a real perception, right? So Ramanuja is saying like that. So it would come to this, that in Vishishtadvaita, there is no experience or object that is unreal. There is no experience or object in Vishishtadvaita which is considered totally false or unreal, right? So the Advaita may ask, what about the shell that is mistaken for silver when we walk on the beach and we see some silver, but it's actually a shell, so we mistake it for a silver coin. So what about the shell that is mistaken for silver owing to the defect in our vision? We didn't see it properly, or in the light. Ramanuja's answer is that in the shell, there is an element, there's an aspect, right? An aspect of silver, right? It's got that silver color, right? That's why there's an illusion. We think it's real silver, but it's not. It's just silver-colored shell, right? Which accounts for the mistake or the illusion, right? It is this fraction of real silver color that is taken to be all silver or actual metal silver, like that. So there's a reality there in that shell, but that is not the same as the metal silver. But still, that perception is a perception of a real thing. So in Vishishtadvaita, Brahman, Ishvara, or God, for all these mean the same thing, is both the cause and the effect, right? Because what is the cause? The cause is the supreme Brahman. The effect is the world of souls and matter, right? So we've already understood that the souls and matter are attributes of the Supreme Lord, attributes of the Lord, and therefore they're his body. They're like likened to his body with that. Remember that we had that Ramanuja has a specific idea, a specific definition of what body means, that which supports, maintains, and controls, and for which and that thing for which is the purpose for God, right? So God maintains, controls, creates, and it's for his purpose. So therefore, that is a body. That is the definition of the body that Ramanuja gives, right? So the Lord is both the cause and the effect, as has been indicated before. Brahman with Chit and Achit in their subtle state is the Upadana Karana, or the material cause, and Brahman with Chit and Chit in their stula, or their gross state as the world, is the effect, right? In reply to the Advaitins' contention that first perception, okay, here we're going to talk again about Nirvikalpika and Savikalpika Pratyaksha. Pratyaksha means perception, Nirvikalpika Pratyaksha means bare first perception, where you don't really understand what a thing is because you haven't seen it for a second time. So in the reply to the Advaitins' idea of the first perception, Pratyaksha, the first perception, right, is perception at the first instance, or kshana. Kshana means second or instant, right? Presents only bare existence without any differentiating features, or beta, right? Differing features. And that this nirvikalpika pratyaksha, which is what the Advaitins call that first type of perception, right, is alone true and valid, presenting as it does pure Brahman without any differentiating features. Ramanuja denies that. Even in the first instance, there is any such thing as Nirvikalpika Pratyaksha. So Nirvikalpika Pratyaksha is not a part of Ramanuja's philosophy, right? And this will be explained why he doesn't accept this idea of Nirvikalpika Pratyaksha. Every Pratyaksha, every instance of perception, every instance of sense perception is not bare and has no understanding of any qualities. Every instance of perception includes qualities and attributes, right? And so there is no such thing as Nirvikalpika Pratyaksha of the Advaitins. And that even at that instant, the perception persists not bare existence, but the configuration or physical structure of the object, which has differentiating features. Now, you may see an unknown animal that you've never seen before. This is an example, right? So you may see an unknown animal, but you still see that animal, right? So you've never seen an elephant before, but when you see it, you see, oh, it's an animal. It's got 4 legs. It has a certain color. It's gray, right? It may have tusks, or it has a trunk. It has a tail, right? It's big, right? So there are all these perceptions that you have of all these different qualities of this thing. Even if you've never seen an elephant before and you have no idea what an elephant is, if you see one, even for the first time, there is no such thing as Nirvikalpika Pratyaksha. Nirvikalpika Pratyaksha means you would see it and you would have no idea of any of these things, the color, the shape, the size, the different limbs. You would have no idea of that. You would just be perceiving something. There's some reality in front of me. That's what the Advaitin calls Nirvikalpika Pratyaksha, bare perception of reality alone. That's nonsense. Okay, so right, all perceptions, whether of the first instance or the latter or subsequent perceptions, right, are only Savikalpika Pratyaksha, or it's also called Sakara Pratyaksha. So we prefer to use Savikalpika Pratyaksha. That's the true. So all Pratyakshas, all perception is with attributes. Whatever we perceive with our senses always has attributes. There's nothing that has no attributes. Even if we say, oh, there's a void, right? So we say outer space is a void. There's nothing there. No, even where even there's a perception there of what a void is, right? There's an idea. The void has attributes. It has the attribute of having no physical matter in it or something like that. So even a void in that sense of outer space has some attribute, right? There is no perception without any attribute. Even the attribute of not having attributes is an attribute, right? Okay, logically. So besides the criticism of Advaita, which occupies the greater part of Vedanta Sangraha, brief references are made to the Beta systems of Bhaskara and Yadava Prakash. So at the time of Ramanuja, these systems, the system of Shankara was there, the Advaita Vedanta. So that's what he primarily wrote against, right? And then there was also the system of his Gurukul teacher, who was called Yadava Prakash, and another teacher of the similar sort of Beta-Vad, difference and non-difference, right, called Bhaskara. So Bhaskara and Yadava Prakash had these forms of Beta. Now, later on, after Ramanuja, right, there are other schools of Beta that we know of, right? So we have Nimbarkas, Nimbarkas Beta, which is called Swabhavika Beta. We have, then we have Chaitanya's, or the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, Achintya Beta. So these are all types of Beta. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these different types. In Bhaskara's system, which is the first system that we know of Beta, Mayavada, or the theory of the world being an illusory appearance due to the shattering of Brahman by Maya, is strongly condemned. So Bhaskara came after Shankara, and he condemned Shankara's idea of Mayavada, or that Brahman has this appearance, this adhyasa, is this appearance of Maya, or ignorance, or avidya, or illusion, which is covering it, right? So he doesn't agree with that. Bhaskara does not agree with that. The reality of the world is affirmed as strongly as in Vishishtadvaita. So in Bhaskara's Beta, he believes he's a realist, right? So we talked about this before, I believe. We talked about Vaivartavad and Parinamavad, right? So Shankara's idea is the world is Vaivartavad. It's an illusion. And all the other personalist Vedantins, they say the world is Parinamavad. It comes about by a real transformation of Brahman into real. The world is real. The souls are real. So the reality of the world is affirmed as strongly as in Vishishtadvaita. So whereas Shankara says Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, this world, only Brahman is real, only Brahman is true, and this world is false, Bhaskara doesn't say that. He agrees that the world is true, is real. But the identity of the jiva with Brahman, according to Bhaskara, which is the apparent purport of such texts like that thou art, is sought to be explained in a manner different from that adopted by the Advaitins and the Vishishtadvaitins, by Bhaskara. So Bhaskara, so we know how Shankara explains the oneness and difference of the world and the souls. We know how Advaita says they're absolutely the same thing. Vishishtadvaita, which we just talked about, Ramanuja's, it says that the souls and the world are the attributes of Brahman, of the supreme Brahman, and in that sense they're one, right? And they're also different because they're real attributes, which are different, right? And they're likened to the body of, they're the body of the supreme, right? Shariri Bhava, which we talked about. Okay, so that's how the two Advaitins and Vishishtadvaitins talk about the sameness and difference of the world and the souls with the supreme Brahman. So Brahman is considered to be full of infinite auspicious qualities, as in Ramanuja's system. So that's nice. So he believes in the Supreme Lord, Ishvara, Brahman, God, supreme person, right? Who has infinite auspicious qualities, Bhaskara, but owing to limiting adjuncts, which are called upadis, right? Upadis are names, for instance, names that we give to things. Anyway, upadis will be explained. Brahman becomes the jivas subject to samsara and its ills, right? So Bhaskara's idea is that the supreme Brahman becomes the jiva because of some limiting adjunct or upadi. Unlike Maya, the illusion of the Advaitins, right, which is postulated to account for the jivas, these adjuncts or upadis are real in Bhaskara's system, right? So Maya, according to the Advaitins, is not real or unreal. So this gets them into a lot of trouble. But Bhaskara says, no, there's some real thing which takes the supreme Brahman and creates out of it the world of matter and the souls. And he calls that an upadi. So Brahman, in a sense, is different from the jiva that has become conditioned by the upadi. At the same time, in mukti or liberation, when the adjuncts or the upadis are gotten rid of, right, the jiva or the individual self becomes one with Brahman by knowing its unity with Brahman, as taught in such passages as he who knows Brahman becomes Brahman. Thus, in another sense, there is no difference between Brahman, right, and the individual self. This system is therefore called Bheda. So right now, there's Bheda. There's difference. The soul is different from the supreme. But once the soul attains liberation, he becomes non-different from the supreme. That's Bhaskara's idea. And there's a real force that acts upon the soul, on the supreme Brahman, that creates the world of matter and souls. This is all his idea. So in holding that moksha or mukti, liberation, the individual self becomes Brahman, from which its difference is only advantageous, right? So adventitious, right? So when the individual soul wants to, when Brahman wants to have some adventure or something in the material world, it becomes a little soul in the world. This is the idea he's trying to say. Bhaskara's system has affinities with Advaita. So it's similar to Advaita, Bhaskara's thing, because ultimately the souls in liberation go back to being one with Brahman, one with the Supreme Brahman. They merge with the Supreme, right? But right now, it's sort of like if you have the water, the water in the water in the ocean, and if you take some water out of the ocean, right? It's separate for some time and then put it back, and then it merges again like that, right? So that's an analogy for Bhaskara's system. Whereas Shankara's system would be that the water that you took out of the ocean, you never took it out of the ocean. It's always in the ocean. But Bhaskara says, no, it's taken out. It's separate for some time. It's really separate, and then it goes back. So difference and oneness, but not at the same time. Exactly. So in liberation, there's oneness. But in non-liberated, when the soul is not liberated, the soul is separate. Like that, basically. So the adjuncts or upadis, we should try to understand what these are the body, the senses, and the mind. The means of attaining mukti or becoming Brahman are both by karma yoga, and jnana yoga, right? Neither of them being merely accessories. So these are methods. These are methods by which Bhaskara says that the soul can overcome these upadis or designations of having a body, senses, and mind, right? Now, in Yadava Prakasha's system of Beta Beta, which is a little different from Bhaskara's, Brahman has within itself a certain power or energy by which it evolves parinama into Ishvara, Chit and Achit. Okay, so parinama, that Brahman has some power within it that forces it, or not forces it, but creates this world of God, the souls, and matter. The means of attaining mukti, which are the same as becoming Brahman, are karma and jnana. This is in Yadava Prakasha's, who was Ramanuja's Gurukul teacher, right, who he left, right, are the same as in Bhaskara's system, both being equally important as in Bhaskara's system. So Yadava Prakasha also says the method of attaining liberation is by karma and jnana. So both of these, Bhaskara and Yadava Prakasha, they both say this. The jiva, which is a modification or a parinama, it's a modification of Brahman. Brahman becomes modified. Of course, this will go against many Upanishadic statements to say that Brahman gets modified. Okay. But anyway, they say, or parinama, which is a modification, right, becomes Brahman again. And this explains the purport of the Mahavakya, that thou art, right? So that you were that, or you will become that sort of thing is what that thou art therefore means. This is also a system called Beta Beta. It's also, Yadava Prakasha's is also called Beta Beta. There may be a slight difference name for Bhaskara's and Yadava Prakasha's Beta Beta, but as far as I know, they're both called Beta Beta, but there's some slight differences here. So this system is also called Beta Beta, as the jiva in one sense is different from Brahman, and in another sense is the same as Brahman. So Sri Ramanuja's criticism of these two systems may be studied in the text itself. So we won't go further into that. The short essay on the Supreme Deity, Nitya Vibhuti, the Supreme Deity, Sriman Narayana, or the Supreme Brahman, right? Nitya Vibhuti, Sri Vaikuntha, and Brahmans being both Upadan Karana, the material cause, and the Nimitta Karana, or the efficient cause of the world, are easy and do not require any explanatory notes. A separate introduction is, however, given at the beginning of the essay on the views of the Mimamsakas, the Karmakandis, the people who talk about Purva Mimamsa, Karmakandis. So there's a note here. In Yadava Prakasha's system, the jiva in mukti becomes one with Brahman by remaining within it as its shakti or power, and with a separate consciousness of its own. So it's interesting. So Bhaskara says that the jiva will completely merge into the Supreme at the time of liberation, whereas Yadava Prakash, he's saying, and this is according to Shruta Prakashika, which is a commentary by Sudarshana Suri, right, on Ramanuja's Shribhashya 444, the fourth chapter, the fourth part, and the fourth verse, or the fourth sutra, right? So in that commentary, Sudarshana Suri says that in Yadava Prakasha's system, that when the jiva attains moksha or liberation, it's considered to be like a power within Brahman, but it has its own separate consciousness, right? So it's still not completely merged with the Supreme Brahman. Okay, so that's very interesting. Okay, so, and that brings us to the end of the introduction to Vedartha Sangraha.
Om Namo Narayanaya. Om Namo Narayanaya.